Hello everyone and welcome back to another art history lecture. I feel like it's a little bit unprofessional for my background and my setup to constantly be changing throughout my channel and my videos, but I don't know, with the conclusion of a very hectic semester, this fresh new start of a new beginning, an emerging summer, new job, new context of everything, I thought it would be a good excuse to have a new change in setup. And also the lighting is just better here. But now that summer is finally here, I'm hopefully crossing my fingers that I will be having a lot more time and a lot more mental threshold and capacity to finally work on all the video essay topics that I've been meaning to. This past week, I've definitely been investing myself back into consuming media and doing things that I meant to that I didn't have time during the academic semester. Like, for instance, trying to get through my constantly never ending unfinished pile of books on my nightstand. I'm sure this is a very common universal experience. I actually have part of it here. This isn't even the whole thing. The rest of it is being used to prop up my laptop and my iPad that I use to record these videos. Also, learning the virtue of patience and watching movies and films that I've been meaning to. I feel like I've I've definitely tried very hard, but film is just not my medium of art consumption preference. I just don't have enough patience for it. I'm such an impatient person. One film in particular that I did finish was Kiss, the 1963 silent film by Warhol. It's really interesting. There's not much plot to it. It's kind of funny. Like, the film itself is kind of funny if you think about it in the context, because it's like literally a silent film of just people making out, like close-up shots of them making out, and apparently it's just Warhol got a bunch of his friends together and just made them like make out in front of him, and he shot it and pieced it together as a film. But it's really interesting. I'm glad I finally watched it so I can understand all the references people make in digital art spaces. But one scene that really stood out to me was this one really long scene of. But one scene that really stood out to me that was pretty extensive was this one kissing scene between Marisol Escobar and this other painter, Harold Stevenson. And I just remember watching it and seeing her face and recognizing her almost immediately because she is such an incredibly beautiful woman, but I just I recognized her face so clearly, but I could not put a name to her. And I just remember seeing her face and almost recognizing her immediately, but not knowing anything about her or her name or why I recognized her so much. And I did a little bit of personal research into it, and apparently she was this incredible feminine pop artist icon of the 60s. And I thought that was really interesting because apparently it is a very common experience to recognize her face for her feminine beauty or, being featured as like this beauty icon in Warhol's films, but never being recognized immediately her own identity and own artwork and own name that she actually did create for herself. That's just not how she's remembered now, which I thought was really interesting. And I kind of immediately thought I had to make a video essay on her because I have spoken about this previously. I do want my channel to serve as kind of this digital history archive of my own personal research into artists and techniques that I find interesting. But I also kind of want my channel to serve as a platform to give voices back to artists who were previously marginalized or kind of put in between the margins of art history that I personally think they should be very widely currently recognized for. She was this incredible, huge pop art icon of the 60s, and nobody really talks about her. Everybody just talks about Warhol and how he got fucking shot because, like, he was anti-feminist. But Marisol Escobar was a Venezuelan and American who was born in France in 1930. And like I said, she is definitely now this hidden inspiration of the entire New York pop art story. And during her time when she was famous and she was producing art as an artist, she didn't even need a last name like Prince or Madonna. She was literally just known as Marisol because she was just so famous and renowned for her work at the time. She's kind of most well known for her boxy cultural sculptural portraits that kind of really embody the pop art movement. And they kind of have this very unique element of humor and dadaism that was kind of rare for its time. And through her portrait sculptures, she kind of molds herself into them to kind of display her own critique of the current political contemporary, her own identity, and stories of her own family. And through this, she kind of, evolved this rapidly changing era of changing gender roles and destruction of previous hierarchical cultural norms. Unfortunately, just to preface this isn't really an uncommon narrative for most very influential female artists, but until very, very recently, where few museums in New York and exhibitions have kind of been commemorated in honor of just her and her work. Essentially, in previous years before that, she was totally deleted from the art world, despite being so highly known and recognized in New York during her time. And she's kind of, like I said, now known as this individual who operated on the outside and only really recognized in the history books as Warhol's affiliate or his friend or just a beautiful face that appeared in his film. But like I said, her work undoubtedly helped define the 60s, and she was born actually Marisol Escobar in Paris to a very wealthy and affluent Venezuelan family. And the family actually moved back to Venezuela around 1935, and in her early years in her childhood, she would spend a majority of her time kind of traveling between New York and Caracas. She always drew from a very young age, and Marisol was actually a nickname given to her that she adopted as her own artist signature and her identity, which alludes to the Spanish words for sea and sun. Unfortunately, her mother ended up committing suicide in 1941, and Marisol kind of in her early years was toggled between these schools in New York and Caracas, and just so much was going on in her life, and she actually went nonverbal and stopped speaking for a majority of her preteens. She actually said in an interview with the New York Times she didn't actually fully start speaking normally in the context of not only speaking out of necessity and speaking in conversation with other people until she was in her late 20s. In 1946, after the tragedy, her family kind of recuperated and decided to move back to Los Angeles, where she studied art at the Otis Art Institute and then at the Jepson Art Institute. She was kind of in between and trying out a lot of different schools. She even studied in Paris at one point during this time, until 1950, when she finally kind of decided to settle back down in New York and took classes at the Art Student League. And up until then, she was just doing fine art, painting, still a student, still kind of learning and try to gauge her own style. It really wasn't until the early 1950s when she saw pre-Columbian art in Mexico when she was visiting her friend, and in several New York art gallery shows in the early 1950s, that she kind of switched over to her primary medium of sculpture and discovered and realized that this was the medium that she really wanted to work and produce with. And through her process with this, she kind of started shifting towards focusing on much more life-size totemic figures and these very mixed media-esque collages of sculptures with wood and painting and found objects. And even though, I've been saying repeatedly over and over again how she was a huge influential icon in the pop art movement, her work specifically differed and contrasted very starkly compared to her very famous pop artist counterparts. And she kind of says directly about her work, quote, "I like to make combinations that seem incongruous, wood with plaster, pencil drawing on wood, but finally I put things where they belong. A hand at the end of an arm, a nose on the middle of the face, a hat on top of the head, a shoe on a foot on a leg, a breast on a woman's torso, a mouth with a little below the nose, and a nostril inside the nose." I feel like her method was very instructive in the way of kind of describing the complexity of her own identity through these kind of incongruous sculptures, but in the end, definitely making sense and kind of universally understanding where all the pieces should align so they can be accessible and understood by everyone. After this, in the early 60s, and is actually when she started producing this startling number of work of sculptures after she finally honed in on these portrait sculptures and realized that this is what she wanted to do. And it's really interesting because especially in the earlier sculptures you can kind of see the color is really blocked off within her sculptures almost, and there's a much more emphasis on the nuance and movement and kind of life breathing-esque of these wooden totemic sculptures compared to the pop art movement where it was all about like visual color and visual just, I mean, it's literally in its name, it's pop art, like it pops out to you because of its visual color appeal. But Marisol didn't really embody that, and in her work a really huge common theme she has is putting in traits or key physical attributes that are very representative of herself and her own hands, and how it's really clear how much she uses her own body and identity when making these pieces. I would say her most ambitious and biggest piece of work is The Party that she made from 1965 to 1966. And in the assemblage, there are 15 freestanding life-size figures with these 3 panels set against the wall. And these figures are kind of arrayed as if they were actually attending a cocktail party and dressed in very elegant evening gowns, and there's like a male and a female pair serving drinks and a single male guest in a tuxedo. Big variety of what would usually comprise of a normal standard cocktail party. But what's interesting is all of these sculptures bear images of Marisol's own face. Like, for example, it's really interesting how she's kind of able to interpret and mold her own motifs in the way she wants it, but still universally understood. Like, for instance, one figure kind of has like this light box installed in her chest, illuminating a picture of a Harry Winston diamond necklace, and on another, a picture of a drink is collaged to one side of her wooden torso. And it's really clear that in this, none of the figures are interacting with each other. Like, each systemic totem is kind of its own island, and all the women are very clearly social distancing and either closing their eyes or looking straight ahead, never at one another. And it seems really snobbish, like not a really pleasant social event that you'd want to be at. Like the figures are just kind of there to show off their upscale fashions, and I would definitely say I really like this work, also because it is a very important social commentary and criticism of the current rituals of high modern society at the time and the shallowness of social interaction that usually underwent at these very high-end social events that Marisol just very clearly did not agree with and didn't like. I feel like found art object, especially in current contemporary times, can be very tricky to really master and perform well, but I really like Marisol's work, especially because rather than really directly carving into the wood, Marisol actually found material that imparted like the spirit of the form that she wished to convey to the audience, and rather than like actually forming the wood itself on the totem, she just kind of attached materials or found objects to the sculpture. And it is only when Marisol adds embellishments or found objects or do the blocky forms of just wood actually become gendered. And because like the breasts or the added forms of material genitalia that she chooses to convey one's gender in the sculpture kind of become more like ornaments rather than actual parts of the wood sculpture themselves. Like the figure is just wearing sunglasses or jewelry or a necklace, not like it's part of its own body. And all of these sculptures almost always have at least one part representative of her own body that she molds, most often her face, like in The Party, and but sometimes other parts of her body, like her hands, which is a super common theme in a lot of her sculptures, or her feet, or an arm. For instance, in honor of her own emotions and grief expressed through Mi Mama Iyo in 1968, it is kind of like this figurative assemblage featuring the artist and her mother before her mother's suicide. And this very autobiographical-esque work kind of depicts Marisol holding an outstretched umbrella over her mother's head, and this is the way I'm interpreting it is kind of a reference to the very heavy burden of Marisol's emotions that happened from this tragedy, and she would produce a lot of various family groups throughout her career, most likely as a way to kind of work and materialize through her childhood trauma. She really loved to play with the theme of critiquing the nuclear family and gender norms, such as this depiction of the most famous family at the time of America in 1961, the Kennedy family. And another piece of work, it's kind of antithesis, the family. You can kind of tell in the sculpture that the family was obviously a little bit low in social standing, even more so without there being like a clear patriarchal head or father of the household. Like, it's not identifiable who is a patriarch in this family. And the woman is seated, looking very tired, and when placed and read next to the Kennedy family, whose subjects are standing on extremely raised platforms, this disparity is very quite noticeable. And from the beginning of her professional career, Marisol was very unflinchingly explicit about chasms and social themes, about class disparity within her work. Very interestingly, there are a lot of queer patrons who really, really highly regard Marisol as a queer cultural icon. And it's interesting because she herself was not very explicitly open about her sexuality, or like being queer wasn't a key part of her artistic identity or even part of her identity at all. I'm not quite sure what her sexuality or orientation was. But the queer community really, really liked her work because, like I said, she kind of focuses on deconstructing and reimagining the nuclear family stereotype. And, this really aligned with many of the experiences of people in the queer communities, especially in New York, who formed kind of these very chosen families when they were rejected by their own biological families for their sexual orientation or choice. I feel like when I read this article, I feel like it really reminded me of this one documentary film I watched last summer called Paris is Burning. It's a really incredible movie. I'm pretty sure it's on the registrar list for best films ever made. It really strongly reminded me of this film because a really huge central theme in the film is that the queer and drag queen communities in New York, they weren't just communities, they were literal families. And although they weren't biological or, formally legally recognized as actual families, these chosen communities provided the acceptance and support that their biological families may have not. And, drag queen culture with its houses and concept of mother queens really embodies this concept of chosen families and deconstructing previous stereotypes of what one might think a real family is. Like I said, a lot of the modern day queer community reveres and collects Marisol's work, and I think the bottom line of why they really resonate and love her work so much is because queer people understand what it's like to be erased from history, and they really resonate with that, and they want to uplift her voice and make sure that her artistic identity is not forgotten in the face of the world. Really similarly to a lot of other really renowned female artists such as Frida Kahlo or Judith Leister, like I said, she really liked to represent her own likeness and her own physical form within her work. Late one night, apparently in the 60s, Marisol was up late working in the studio and she was the only one there, and she didn't really have anyone to sit there and model for her, so she kind of decided to make a cast of her own face, something she would go on to do over and over again within her work. And I would definitely say she wasn't really using her own face as a sculptural portrait just for the sake of convenience, like in that one context. But I would definitely say she did it over and over again because it was also a way of being able to better understand herself. And she actually explained, quote, "There comes a point when you start asking, who am I? I was trying to figure out through my sculpture, and that's why I made all those masks. Every time I would take a cast of my face, it came out different. You have a Like I'm gonna say a lot of her works was this huge contemporary critique of gender roles and gender norms, and many of her sculptures spoke to the role of woman in society. For example, her baby girl sculpture kind of asks the viewer if the woman should be infantilized, a question kind of brought by the culture at the time, which sold in the 60s like baby doll dresses, and women started to refer to themselves as like babes. And it's really interesting because in this specific sculpture, the baby girl is holding a statue of Marisol herself. In 1962, this is when Marisol met Warhol and was introduced and fell in love with the downtown New York party scene. And it's really undeniable, even if you watch the films that she's in, she has this kind of irresistible, undeniable chic glamour. She has this presence, like this aura, like this je ne sais quoi that really proved irresistible to standards of beauty and just what was considered iconic at the time. Unfortunately, with this newset fame of her physical presence and her aura, there was a lot of sexism that came with the acclaim, inevitably. By Life magazine, she was referred to as a Latin beauty, and by Playboy magazine as a sensual senorita. And to the Time magazine, she was a black-haired, wide-eyed, unmarried woman of 33. Kind of a little bit upsetting to see how it's inevitable for a beautiful woman to enter the eye of the public and just automatically it's inevitable that she's going to be sexualized. And ironically, even though the practice of inserting your own bodily forms of identity within the work is very common and very renowned, repeated practice, like for example Picasso did it all the time, a lot of male critics ironically thought Marisol's use of her own body was narcissistic and found the work to be kind of too delectable. That was a direct quote. Too delectable, too evocative, which is really incredibly ironic and upsetting. This is something I talk about a lot in my previous video essays, especially with other female artists who really struggled with being able to find their own fame and their own voice through their artwork and, getting recognition for it without it being sexualized. It was during this time, even now, it's literally impossible. 1962 was also when she started gaining this huge momentum of fame internationally through art magazines and critiques. Everyone really loved her work. In 1964, she had a solo exhibition at Stable Gallery that received up to 2,000 visitors a day, and also a solo show in Sidney Janis Gallery in 1966 that was even more popular. Both of these shows, really immense success, actually ended up kind of spooking her and scaring her away from kind of being in the public eye too much, very understandably so. And she kind of spent a bit of time there figuring things out for herself, what she wanted to represent, her own artwork, I'm assuming so. But when she came back to New York, she kind of realized that in 18 months, the whole art scene had completely changed, and very dramatically so, and like many women, just because of the short respite she had away, she had been written out and deleted from it. I think this is when, after the 60s, I would definitely mark this as a very significant point in her stylistic and artistic choices, because this is when she kind of decided to make what I see as a very monumental departure from pop art. And rather than focusing on making artwork that highlighted pieces from current pop culture or even her own identity, she kind of makes this very outward shift of starting to make pieces and sculpt things that were a lot more directly politically charged beyond herself or in homage of other famous artists. In the 70s, she started this project, this portrait sculpture that created homages to a lot of really old famous artists that inspired her in the past, such as Graham, Picasso, Duchamp, and O'Keeffe. But she never really lost her own stylistic sense in the idea of inserting her own bodily forms into these pieces. Like, for instance, in the portrait of Georgia O'Keeffe with her dogs that she created in 1977, she still used casts of her own hands for the painters. She also kind of started to illuminate a lot of more directly specific politically charged events or issues rather than a very broad social critique, such as focusing on various disadvantaged or minority groups, such as she did this portrait sculpture of the Dust Bowl migrants. Like, for instance, in 1993, the Blackfoot tribe actually put out a request to super famous, various renowned artists to create a commemoration piece for their indigenous tribe and their name, and Marisol was actually the only one that responded. And she created this really incredible piece in 1993 based off a photograph of 3 members of the Blackfoot delegation. And she really created this incredible piece that is very incredibly representative of the struggle and the anguish that indigenous tribes at the time had to face and go through when going through these land negotiations with Western settlers and colonists. And for all of her final years of life, she really did dedicate herself to creating these incredible works that were still remain to be beyond herself. And after a very long battle with Alzheimer's, Marisol passed away in 2016 at the age of 86 in basically near obscurity from the public. And like I said, it really wasn't until years after her mortal death that she actually became better known again and recognized in the art world. Like, for instance, the Andy Warhol Museum did an exhibition specifically on her called Marisol and Warhol Take New York. But even then, I think it's really interesting that she can't be recognized and have an exhibition for herself without having Warhol's name attached to it, or being recognized as her own identity as an artist without the affiliation of Warhol. And I really just did want to create this video essay in a commemoration of her incredible, brilliant legacy as an artist who, despite facing minimal erasure, made a huge mark on the 60s pop art movement, and her ability to capture the essence of contemporary life at the time through her Dadaist and humorous portrait sculptures. And when we look back on her life and work, along with a lot of very well-known female artists, I think it's really important to recognize how much that they really did have to endure to preserve their own identity and their own name in the face of the public without being directly associated with a masculine name or recognized for sexualizing herself with her artwork. And even now, with kind of this reemergence in popularity of her work, I think it's really important that we recognize and preserve her identity as an artist for being Marisol, and honoring the incredible contributions that she made to the pop art world herself, without anyone else, and nothing else attached to it. Now that summer has commenced, I'm very glad that I'm able to make such random videos like that on the spot and on the spur if they inspire me. And hopefully during this break before my job starts and things start picking back up again, I'm able to create more videos like this and recognize contributions of marginalized artist voices that I think should be echoed and relayed still. So, like I say at the end of every video, I hope you learned something from this. I hope this video inspired you in some way. And I am so grateful for everyone that is so nice to me in my comments and provides such digital community support, because I really do like making these videos and seeing everyone's comments and thoughts about the topic I made. So thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you soon in my next art history lecture. Bye!